I never thought a heat lamp would almost cost me my house, my sanity, and my will to ever interact with another human being again. But that is exactly what happened one brutal January when the temperatures in our neighborhood dropped so fast and so hard that the local news started using words like historic and dangerous. And my neighbor Phil called me from 2 streets over just to say, "Doug, buddy, I think the air outside actually hates us." He was not wrong. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because this story has layers, and every single one of them involves a woman named Cynthia Prewitt. I moved into Maplecrest Estates about 4 years ago. It is a nice enough neighborhood, the kind with modest 2-story homes, decent yards, and streets wide enough that 2 cars can pass each other without one of them climbing a curb. When I bought my place, the realtor mentioned the HOA almost as an afterthought, the way someone mentions there is a small scratch on a used car right before you sign the paperwork. "It is very low-key," she said with a smile that I have since learned to distrust completely. "Just keeps the neighborhood looking nice." Sure it did. The Maplecrest Estates HOA was, in practice, a 3-person committee with delusions of grandeur, a laminated rulebook the size of a novella, and one very motivated enforcer who went by Cynthia Prewitt. Cynthia lived 4 houses down from me on the left side of the street. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, wore the same puffy vest in rotating colors, kept her driveway absolutely spotless even in winter, and carried herself with the energy of someone who had once been told she had leadership potential and had never recovered from it. Cynthia was the kind of person who took neighborhood aesthetics personally. Not in the way a reasonable person might notice a broken fence and mention it kindly. No, Cynthia took it personally in the way a military general takes enemy territory personally. She patrolled, she photographed, she filed. I had heard stories from neighbors about her before my first real encounter. Marcus from 3 houses down told me she had fined someone for parking a kayak in their backyard because it was technically visible from the street if you stood on a ladder. He said it as a warning. I did not take it seriously enough. That was my first mistake. My second mistake, apparently, was trying to keep my outdoor pipes from bursting in sub-zero temperatures using a perfectly legal, commercially available, outdoor-rated heat lamp. Here is how that particular mess started. December in our part of the state had been rough. We got 2 snowfalls before Christmas, which was not unusual, but the second one dropped about 8 inches in 24 hours and then stayed. The temperatures never climbed high enough to melt anything. By New Year's, the snow on the ground had developed that crunchy, icy crust on top that sounds like breaking crackers when you walk on it, and the streets were a patchwork of cleared asphalt and sneaky black ice. Everyone in the neighborhood was dealing with something. Phil's snowblower threw a belt, and he had to shovel his entire driveway by hand for 2 weeks. The Garcias on the corner had their propane delivery delayed 4 days and were living with a space heater and a mountain of blankets. My own furnace decided to be dramatic right before Christmas, and the HVAC guy told me my heat exchanger was looking tired, which cost me $800 I had not planned on spending. But the real threat in my house was the plumbing on the back exterior wall. My house was built in the early 90s, and whoever designed it made the genuinely baffling decision to run a section of water supply piping along the interior surface of the back exterior wall in the utility space beside my garage. During a normal winter with normal temperatures, this was a minor quirk you barely noticed. During a winter where the overnight lows were dropping to 12, 10, sometimes single digits below 0, this was a disaster waiting to happen. I had already had a plumber out in November when I noticed one of the pipes felt colder than it should. He looked it over, tapped a few things, and told me the insulation in that wall section was inadequate, something that would cost a few $1,000s to properly fix, involving pulling drywall and reinsulating from scratch. He wrapped the pipes in foam pipe insulation as a stopgap, said it would help, but told me very clearly that if we got into a serious cold snap, I should keep supplemental heat in that space. "What kind of supplemental heat?" I asked. "A heat lamp works well," he said. Get one of those outdoor-rated clamp ones, point it toward the pipe section, leave it on overnight when temps drop below 15. You'll be fine. He wrote it in his service notes. I still have that paper. That matters later, so tuck it away in your memory. I bought the heat lamp from a hardware store. It was one of those standard red bulb utility lamps, the kind people use in garages and workshops and chicken coops all over the country. Outdoor rated on a metal clamp designed to handle cold and moisture. I set it up in the utility space, which is a small recessed area at the back of my house where the pipes are exposed. It was not visible from the street. You could not see it from any neighboring yard without actively going around the back of my property. I ran an extension cord from an outdoor outlet, positioned the lamp so it was a safe distance from anything flammable, and when the weather forecast called for overnight temps of 8 degrees Fahrenheit on the second Thursday of January, I turned it on before I went to bed. The pipes did not freeze. The heat lamp did its job. I slept fine. At 6:15 the next morning, I was standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe making coffee when I heard a knock at my front door. Not a polite knock, the kind of knock that lands like someone is testing whether the door is structural. I opened it to find Cynthia Prewitt standing on my porch in her navy puffy vest, a clipboard pressed against her chest, and an expression that suggested she had been awake since 4 and had been looking forward to this moment. "Mr. Turner," she said, making my name sound like an accusation. "Cynthia," I said, "it is 6 in the morning." "I am aware of the time," she said. "I am also aware that you have an unauthorized electrical device operating on the exterior of your property." I blinked. "I'm sorry, the heat lamp on your back utility wall. I spotted it last night during my evening walkthrough." I want to pause here and let that sentence land. Her evening walkthrough. In 8-degree weather, at what must have been close to 10 or 11 at night, Cynthia Prewitt walked the neighborhood in near-zero temperatures specifically to check on what her neighbors were doing. I stood there in my bathrobe with my coffee, trying to process this, and I genuinely could not figure out whether to feel impressed or horrified. I landed on both. "Cynthia," I said carefully, "the heat lamp is on the back of my house, inside the utility recess. How did you see it?" She straightened slightly. "I was cutting through the common greenspace path. The common greenspace path runs along the back of a few properties on my side of the street. It is a narrow walking trail that technically belongs to the HOA as shared property. If you walked it at night and happened to look through the gap in my fence that leads to the utility space, and if you were specifically looking for something to object to, you might catch a glimpse of a faint red glow from the heat lamp. So Cynthia had been walking the back path at night in sub-zero temperatures and had spotted my heat lamp through a fence gap. She had then come to my door at 6 in the morning the next day. "It's a heat lamp," I said. "My pipes could freeze without it. The plumber recommended it." "The HOA Guidelines, Section 12, Subsection 4, she said, flipping to a laminated page on her clipboard like she had rehearsed this, "prohibit unauthorized exterior electrical devices or installations that have not received prior HOA approval." "It's not an installation," I said. "It's a clamp lamp on an extension cord. Any powered device operating on the exterior of your property falls under this guideline," she said firmly. "I will be filing a formal notice of violation today. You will receive a fine in the amount of $150, and the device must be removed within 24 hours. She handed me a pre-printed yellow form right there on the spot. She had apparently already filled it out before she knocked. She turned and walked back down my porch steps with the crisp efficiency of someone who had genuinely enjoyed their morning. I stood there in my bathrobe, holding a violation notice, watching her walk away into the frozen dawn with her clipboard, and I thought, okay, so that is how this is going to go. I went back inside, finished my coffee, and started doing my homework. Now I want to be clear about something. I am not a lawyer. I took one paralegal course at a community college about 15 years ago because I thought it would be useful. And honestly it was, but I am not a legal professional. What I am is someone who reads carefully, takes notes, and does not respond to a situation emotionally when I can respond to it strategically instead. My ex-wife used to call this my extremely annoying courtroom energy, and I choose to take that as a compliment. The first thing I did was pull up the actual Maplecrest Estates HOA governing documents, not the printed summary sheet they hand you when you move in. The actual CC and RS, the conditions, covenants, and restrictions, which are filed as a legal document with the county, and which supersede the more informal rules and guidelines the HOA board hands out. Most homeowners never read these. Most HOA boards know this and rely on it. I had read them when I moved in, made a few notes, and now I went back to them with fresh eyes. Section 12, subsection 4, as Cynthia had quoted it, did exist. It read, "No homeowner shall install permanent electrical fixtures, wiring, or devices on the exterior of their property without prior written approval from the HOA board." The key word, which Cynthia had conveniently skipped over in her recitation, was permanent. A clamp lamp on an extension cord was not a permanent installation by any reasonable definition of the word. It had no mounting hardware, no electrical work, no modification to the structure. It was, legally and practically, a temporary device. The same guideline, incidentally, would technically cover Christmas lights if enforced literally, which it was not, because Cynthia had a very nice light display on her own house that I could see from my front window. Second thing I did was call my plumber, a guy named Ray, and ask him to email me a copy of his service notes from November. He did it within an hour. The notes clearly stated that he had recommended supplemental heat for the utility pipe section during extreme cold events, and specifically mentioned a heat lamp as an appropriate solution. Third thing I did was pull up our state's landlord-tenant code and property law summaries, not because I was a landlord, but because those statutes contain provisions about habitability and reasonable property maintenance that sometimes apply to HOA enforcement disputes. In our state, there is a provision that essentially says no HOA restriction can be applied in a way that prevents a homeowner from taking reasonable measures to prevent significant property damage. Frozen and burst pipes causing water damage absolutely qualify as significant property damage. I had documentation from a licensed professional recommending the exact measure I had taken. This was going to be relevant. I wrote all of this down in a document. Then I sent Cynthia a certified letter, return receipt requested, stating that I was formally contesting the violation and requesting a hearing before the HOA board as provided for in the governing documents. I also included a copy of Ray's service notes and a printout of the relevant CC and R language, with permanent highlighted in yellow. I mailed it that afternoon in the snow because I believe in the power of physical paper when you are dealing with people who think a laminated clipboard is a legal instrument. The hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening, which gave me about 10 days. During those 10 days, I did a few more things. I talked to my neighbors, not in a conspiratorial way. I just started having the conversations I should have been having for months. I talked to Marcus, who I already knew had grievances. He told me about the kayak situation and also mentioned that he had received a fine the previous spring for having a non-standard mailbox post, even though his post was the exact same style as 4 other houses on the street. He had paid the fine because fighting it seemed like too much trouble. He still had the notice somewhere. I talked to the Garcias on the corner. Alina Garcia told me that Cynthia had sent her a written warning last fall for hanging laundry on a backyard drying rack, which was visible from the back path. Not from the street, from the back path. Alina had taken it down and never said anything, but she was still irritated about it. I talked to a woman named Janet Holloway 3 houses up, who was retired and home during the day and had, as she put it, a very good memory and a filing system. Janet had been in the neighborhood for 12 years. She told me that the HOA board had issued 7 fines in the past 3 years, and she was pretty sure at least 4 of them had gone to households that were in some kind of minor dispute with Cynthia or had declined to vote for her HOA board re-election the previous year. She did not have proof of that connection, but she thought it was worth looking into. I started keeping a log of everything. Every conversation, every date, every document. I also, and this is something I am quietly proud of, reviewed the HOA's own financial records, which are required by our state's HOA statute to be available to homeowners upon written request. I submitted that request on day 3. On day 5, something happened that changed the shape of things considerably. A pipe burst on Elm Ridge Court, 3 streets over. The homeowner, a guy named Curtis, had come home from work to find water running under his garage door and down his driveway, where it had frozen into a sheet of ice that stretched halfway to the street. The pipe that had burst was an exterior utility line, almost identical to my situation. The water damage to his garage and part of his finished basement was estimated at $11,000. It made the neighborhood Facebook group within about 20 minutes, and the comment thread filled up fast with people talking about the cold snap, pipe insulation, and what they were doing to protect their own plumbing. I posted in that thread, not to be dramatic but because it was directly relevant. I explained that I had a plumber's recommendation to use a heat lamp on my exterior pipes, and that I had been fined by the HOA for doing so. I was careful, factual, and did not editorialize. I did not call Cynthia by name. I did not need to. The response was immediate. Within 2 hours, I had over 60 comments and 30 direct messages. Most of them were from neighbors who were either in similar situations with their own plumbing, or who had their own grievances with HOA enforcement, or who were just genuinely alarmed that someone could be fined for taking a plumber-recommended precaution against property damage in sub-zero weather. A few people shared their own violation stories. One man named Derek said he had been cited for having a snow blower visible in his open garage during a snowstorm, which was, and I quote, "the most insane thing I have read on this platform, and I have been on this platform for 9 years." Cynthia commented on my post, publicly. She wrote, "The HOA rules exist to protect property values and community standards for everyone. Individual circumstances do not exempt homeowners from compliance. Matters like this are handled through proper channels." She also tagged the HOA's Facebook page, which she ran. That comment got 37 angry emoji reactions and 1 thumbs up, which I am pretty sure was from her own account. Now, here is where things started to get genuinely interesting. Janet, my neighbor with the 12-year memory and the filing system, called me on day 6 and said, "Doug, I found something." She came over that evening with a manila folder, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, and showed me what she had. She had gone through her own records and put together a rough timeline of HOA fines issued over the past 3 years. She had cross-referenced it with a sign-in sheet from the HOA election meeting 2 years ago, which was posted in the meeting minutes available on the HOA's website. What she found was that 5 of the 7 fines issued in the past 3 years had gone to households whose residents either had not attended the election meeting, had voted against Cynthia's board re-election, or had previously raised objections at HOA meetings. That was not proof of anything on its own, but it was a pattern, and patterns are where you start. I looked at the financial records I had requested. The HOA collected monthly dues from 62 homes in Maple Crest Estates. The dues were $45 a month per household, which came to about $33,000 a year. The budget documents showed routine expenses, landscaping of common areas, insurance, some administrative costs, and a reserve fund for maintenance projects. That all tracked, but there was a line item in the last 2 years' budgets labeled Administrative Compliance and Enforcement Services that totaled nearly $4,000 between the 2 years. There was no further detail. I sent a follow-up written request for an itemized breakdown of that expense category. The HOA had 15 days to respond under state statute. In the meantime, Wednesday came. The HOA hearing was held in the community room of a small clubhouse at the end of the main road. It was a plain room with folding tables and chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a whiteboard that still had someone's meeting agenda from December on it. The board consisted of 3 people: Cynthia Prewitt, a man named Gerald who was the board president and who seemed like he genuinely wanted to be anywhere else, and a woman named Sue who smiled nervously at everything and agreed with whoever spoke most recently. I arrived with a folder of documents, Ray's service notes, printouts of the relevant CC and R language, and a printed summary of the state habitability and maintenance provision I had found. I also brought Marcus, who sat in the audience, and Janet, and the Garcias, and Derek, the snow blower guy. About 11 neighbors showed up in total, which was, according to Janet, more people than had ever attended a regular HOA meeting in her 12 years in the neighborhood. Gerald looked at the room and seemed to recalibrate whatever he had been expecting this evening to be. Cynthia looked at the room and pressed her clipboard a little tighter to her chest. I presented my case calmly and methodically. I explained the pipe situation, Ray's recommendation, the nature of the heat lamp as a temporary device, the distinction between temporary and permanent, as it applied to Section 12, subsection 4, and the state provision regarding homeowner maintenance rights. I handed Gerald a copy of all my documentation. I was polite, organized, and did not raise my voice once. When I finished, Cynthia spoke. She argued that permanent in the context of the guideline meant any device that remains in place for more than a single use, which was a definition she appeared to have invented on the spot, because that language existed nowhere in the governing documents. She argued that allowing exceptions would set a precedent. She argued that the rules were the rules and that individual circumstances could not be considered. Gerald was nodding along, but I could see him reading my documents while Cynthia talked. He got to the part about the state statute and his nodding slowed down. Then Marcus raised his hand and asked if he could speak. Gerald said yes. Marcus stood up and gave a very clear, very composed summary of his own experience with the non-standard mailbox post fine and his belief that the post in question was identical to several others on the street that had not been cited. He had photos on his phone and showed them to Gerald. Alina Garcia then raised her hand and described her backyard laundry rack situation. Derek told the snow blower story. The room laughed. Cynthia did not. Janet stood up last and said, very calmly, that she had noticed what appeared to be a pattern in HOA enforcement over the past few years and that she would like the board to review it at their next meeting. She did not make accusations. She just described the pattern she had observed and asked for transparency. Gerald looked at Sue. Sue looked at her hands. Cynthia started talking quickly about community standards and the importance of consistent enforcement and how these complaints were being raised improperly, that this was a hearing about one specific matter and not a general grievance session. Gerald said, "Cynthia, let them finish." That was the first crack I had seen in the board's united front, and it was significant. Gerald was not stupid. He could read the room, and the room was 11 unhappy homeowners with documentation and a collective memory. The board took a 30-minute recess to deliberate. Gerald and Sue went to a smaller side room. Cynthia went with them and came back out twice to get water and glare at nothing in particular. When they came back, Gerald announced that the violation against me was being overturned. He cited the distinction between temporary and permanent devices, acknowledged Ray's professional recommendation, and said the board would be issuing a clarifying addendum to Section 12, subsection 4 to prevent ambiguity in the future. He also said the board would review the other concerns raised by neighbors and address them at the next general meeting, which he announced would be open and publicly noticed, scheduled for 3 weeks out. Cynthia said nothing. Her face said a great deal. I thanked Gerald, shook his hand, and collected my documents. Outside in the parking lot in the cold, with everyone's breath making little clouds in the air and the snow crunching under our boots, my neighbors congratulated me with the specific relief of people who have been frustrated about something for a long time and have finally seen it named out loud. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. Elena gave me a hug that surprised me pleasantly. Derek offered to buy everyone coffee, and a small group of us ended up at the diner on Route 9, crammed into 2 booths, talking for 2 hours about the neighborhood and the HOA and the general absurdity of the preceding several weeks. It was the best I had felt about Maple Crest Estates since the day I moved in. But here is the thing about stories involving Cynthia Prewitt. They do not end at the point where a reasonable person would accept the outcome and move on. The itemized budget breakdown arrived in my mailbox 9 days later, right at the edge of the 15-day deadline. I had asked for a detailed accounting of the Administrative Compliance and Enforcement Services line item from the HOA budget. What I received was a letter stating that those expenses represented contracted professional services for HOA administration and compliance oversight, and listing 2 vendors by name. The amounts paid to each vendor over 2 years totaled just under $4,000 combined. I looked up both vendors. The first one was a legitimate HOA management consulting firm, a small operation but a real one with a real address and a real website. They accounted for about $1,400 of the total, which was plausible for occasional consulting work. The second one was a company called Prewitt Administrative Solutions. It had an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a P.O. box registered 6 weeks before the first payment to it appeared in the HOA budget. The company had no website, no business registration visible in the state's public database as of the time I checked, and the name matched Cynthia Prewitt's surname in a way that was either a remarkable coincidence or not a coincidence at all. $2,400 had been paid by the HOA to Prewitt Administrative Solutions over 2 budget years. Cynthia Prewitt was on the HOA board. If Cynthia Prewitt owned or controlled Prewitt Administrative Solutions and had directed HOA funds to it without disclosure and without board approval from disinterested parties, that was not an HOA procedural dispute. That was financial fraud. Specifically, it would be self-dealing, which is a form of breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on the amounts and the circumstances, potentially criminal under state statutes governing nonprofit organizations and homeowners associations, which our HOA was structured as. I sat with this for a full day before I did anything about it. I wanted to be sure I was reading it correctly and not jumping to a conclusion. I called a lawyer friend named Annette who does nonprofit law, explained the situation without naming names, described the structure of what I had found, and asked her what she thought. Said, if what you are describing is accurate, that is at minimum a serious breach of fiduciary duty and potentially criminal self-dealing. If the board president knew and approved it without proper disclosure, he may also have liability. You should document everything and consider whether to file a complaint with the state attorney general's office, which has a consumer protection and charity division that handles HOA fraud. I said, what if I'm not sure the payments were actually fraudulent? What if there's an explanation? She said. Then the explanation should be documented in board minutes and disclosed to homeowners. If it isn't, that's already a problem. You can request the board meeting minutes for the periods in question. If the contract with this vendor was properly approved and disclosed, it will appear in the minutes. If it doesn't appear in the minutes, you have your answer. I requested the board meeting minutes for the 2 budget years in question. I submitted the request in writing, certified mail, return receipt. I was getting very practiced at this. While I waited, life in the neighborhood continued in the way winter life does, which is to say with difficulty and a certain bleak humor. The temperatures finally broke in early February, climbing above freezing for the first time in 6 weeks. The snow started melting, and immediately revealed everything the winter had been hiding: potholes, dead grass, a forgotten garden gnome that had been buried since December and now emerged from the melt looking vaguely victorious. The roads improved enough that the morning commute stopped being a daily act of faith, and people started to emerge from their houses again with the cautious optimism of people who have been through something and are not sure it is fully over. The HOA's open general meeting came. Gerald had given 2 weeks of proper public notice, which was unusual enough to generate buzz on the neighborhood Facebook group. About 30 homeowners showed up, which was nearly half the households in Maplecrest Estates. I had never seen more than 8 people at a HOA meeting, according to Janet, who had attended most of them. Gerald ran the meeting with more energy than I had seen from him at the hearing. He presented the clarifying addendum to Section 12, Subsection 4, which defined permanent, in the context of exterior devices, as requiring physical attachment to the structure or dedicated wiring. A temporary, movable device on an extension cord was explicitly excluded. He also announced that the HOA would be creating a formal appeals process for violations, with written criteria and timelines, so that homeowners had a clear mechanism to contest fines. Marcus raised his mailbox post-issue during the open comment period. Gerald acknowledged it, said the board would review the records, and if the post in question met the same specifications as other approved posts in the community, the fine would be refunded. Marcus looked quietly satisfied in the way of a man who has been waiting 2 years for that. Cynthia was present at the meeting. She sat at the board table and said very little. Her clipboard was there, but she barely touched it. She had the look of someone watching their carefully arranged furniture being rearranged by other people. Toward the end of the meeting, a homeowner I had not met before, a man named Gary who lived on the far side of the development, asked about the HOA's budget and financial transparency. He said he had heard some things and wanted to know when the annual financial report would be available. Gerald said the report would be posted to the HOA website within 30 days as required by statute. Gary said thank you in the tone of someone who was going to be checking. 2 days after the general meeting, I received the board meeting minutes. I read through them carefully. The minutes for the 2 years in question were, in most places, fairly routine. Meeting called to order, agenda items, votes taken, meeting adjourned. Standard HOA stuff. I went through each set of minutes looking for any reference to a contract with Prewitt Administrative Solutions, any disclosure by Cynthia of a personal financial interest in a vendor, any vote authorizing payment to that vendor. There was nothing. Not a single mention of Prewitt Administrative Solutions in any set of meeting minutes across 24 months of board meetings. That meant the payments had been made without board approval as a formal agenda item, and without any disclosed conflict of interest. The money had gone from the HOA accounts to a company bearing Cynthia's name without the other board members apparently being told what it was or who owned it, or without the minutes reflecting any discussion of it even if they had been told informally. I called Annette again. She said, "File the complaint. This is exactly what the Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division is there for. Include your documentation, the budget records, the vendor name, the minutes, and your analysis. Let them investigate. That is not your job. Your job is to get the information to the right people." I drafted the complaint over 2 evenings. I was thorough. I included the HOA's financial summaries, the budget line items, the corporate name search results, the meeting minutes showing no approval or disclosure, and a clear chronological narrative of how I had come to find the information. I also noted that the enforcement activity that had led me to investigate the financials had been initiated by a board member who appeared to have a personal financial interest in the HOA's budget that had not been disclosed. I filed the complaint with the State Attorney General's office online. I also filed a copy with the state's HOA regulatory ombudsman, which our state has because the legislature recognized some years back that HOA governance issues were significant enough to warrant a dedicated oversight body. I sent courtesy copies by certified mail to Gerald and to the HOA's registered address. I did not send one to Cynthia. Gerald called me within 36 hours of receiving his copy. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had just found a very large and unexpected bill in his mailbox and was trying to decide how to feel about it. He said he had not been aware of the payments to Prewitt Administrative Solutions and had assumed the compliance line items in the budget were related to the legitimate consulting firm. He said he was going to consult with the HOA's attorney immediately. I told him I thought that was a very good idea and that I hoped the board would cooperate fully with any investigation. He asked if I was going to pursue this. I said, Gerald, I filed a heat lamp variance request and got hit with a $150 fine at 6 in the morning in January. I am already pursuing this. There was a pause. He said, fair enough. The State Attorney General's office sent an acknowledgement letter within 2 weeks. They said the complaint had been received and assigned for review. That was all they said, which is what they say at that stage, but it meant someone was looking at it. In the meantime, the neighborhood Facebook group had become a genuinely active community forum for the first time in its existence. People were posting about their pipe protection setups, their snow clearing schedules, who had a good plumber, whose driveway was still icy and needed salt. It was the kind of community activity that had apparently been waiting to happen and just needed a reason to start. Derek started a neighborhood winter prep info thread, and it got 73 comments. Elena Garcia organized a neighborhood winter potluck for the last Saturday in February, just as the worst of the cold was breaking, partly to celebrate the end of the most brutal stretch of weather in years, and partly because she said, I want to actually know my neighbors, and I do not want it to take a fight with the HOA to make that happen every time. The potluck was at the community room, the same one where my hearing had been held. About 40 people came. Someone brought chili, someone brought cornbread. Marcus brought a truly remarkable amount of pierogies that he had apparently made from scratch, which won him more goodwill in one evening than the HOA had generated in 3 years. I brought a case of hard cider and spent 3 hours having the kind of conversations you have when you realize you have been living near good people and just not taking the time. Cynthia was not there. She had been notably quieter since the general meeting. I still saw her sometimes, getting her mail, scraping her driveway, but she no longer walked the back path in the evenings. She had not filed a new violation notice against anyone in the neighborhood in over a month, which was apparently a record. The Attorney General's investigation took about 8 weeks from the date of my initial complaint to produce its first concrete result. I received a letter informing me that the review had found probable cause to believe that HOA funds had been misappropriated through undisclosed self-dealing transactions, in violation of state nonprofit corporation law and HOA governance statutes. The matter was being referred for formal investigation and potential criminal prosecution. Cynthia Prewitt was informed of this by investigators, not by me. She retained a lawyer, which was her right. The investigation confirmed that she had, through a shell company she had set up and controlled, billed the HOA for administrative and compliance consulting services that were either never performed or were performed by her in her capacity as a board member doing normal board work she was not entitled to separately compensate herself for. The total amount involved was $2,400, which is not a staggering sum in the abstract but is legally significant because the statute governing HOA financial misconduct does not have a minimum threshold. The crime is the self-dealing, not the specific dollar amount. She was formally charged with 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty by a nonprofit officer and 1 count of theft by deception. The theft by deception charge is a misdemeanor at that amount under our state's tiered statute, but the breach of fiduciary duty count is a separate civil and potentially criminal matter that carries its own penalties. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea initially, and then about 6 weeks later, she accepted a negotiated resolution that required her to repay the full $2,400 to the HOA, resign from the board immediately and permanently, agree to a 5-year ban on serving on any HOA board in the state, pay a fine to the state, and complete a specified number of community service hours. No jail time, which some of my neighbors thought was too lenient, but the plea kept it from dragging through a trial process, and it put real, documented consequences on her record. Gerald was not charged with anything. The investigation concluded he had not knowingly participated in the scheme, though his oversight had been inadequate. He remained on the board but agreed to implement a series of financial transparency reforms, including quarterly budget summaries posted to the HOA website, dual signature requirements for any vendor payments, and mandatory annual financial review by a neutral third party. The morning after Cynthia's formal resignation was announced in a notice to all homeowners from Gerald, I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, looking out the back window at my yard. It was early March by then. The snow was almost entirely gone, just a few stubborn patches in the deepest shaded corners. The ground was wet and gray, but there was the very early suggestion, just a suggestion of something warmer coming. The heat lamp was back in my garage, sitting on the shelf next to the pipe insulation and the bag of ice melt and all the other winter gear I had not needed much in the final weeks. The pipes were fine, had been fine all winter. I thought about the moment Cynthia had knocked on my door at 6 in the morning in January, holding that pre-filled violation notice, and I thought about how different things would have been if I had just paid the fine. $150. I could have paid it. It would have been easier in the short term, but I had been aggravated enough and stubborn enough and just organized enough to push back instead. And in doing so, I had somehow ended up connected to my neighbors, familiar with my own property rights, and part of the reason a woman who had been using a neighborhood association as her personal enforcement mechanism and cash machine for the better part of 3 years no longer had the ability to do so. Marcus got his mailbox fine refunded, $215, plus the HOA waived 3 months of his dues as a goodwill gesture. Elena Garcia put her laundry rack back in the backyard. I know because I could see it from the path. Good for her. Derek had his snowblower in his garage with the door open all winter and not a single comment from anyone. The new HOA board, once it was restructured to add a 4th member to prevent tie votes and provide a buffer against any one person dominating proceedings, turned out to be pretty functional. Gerald ran more transparent meetings. The new 4th member, a woman named Carol who taught high school civics and had the organized energy of someone who had been reading meeting minutes for sport for years, brought real rigor to the process without being Cynthia about it. There is a difference between enforcing rules fairly and wielding them as a weapon, and Carol seemed to understand that instinctively. At the spring general meeting in April, Gerald presented the financial reform package. Every homeowner in the development received a summary of the previous year's budget and the plan for the current year. The administrative compliance and enforcement services line item was gone, replaced by 2 clearly labeled items, one for legitimate HOA management consulting and one for the new neutral financial review. Both had named vendors, disclosed contracts, and board vote documentation. Someone at the meeting asked what had happened to the recovered $2,400. Gerald said the board had decided to put it toward repairs on the common greenspace path, which had some erosion damage and a section of crumbling surface near the back fence line. By mid-May, the path had been resurfaced, and there were new solar-powered path lights installed at intervals, the kind that click on automatically at dusk and make the walk actually pleasant in the evening. I walked it one night in late May, first time I had ever walked it deliberately as a resident rather than cut through it on an errand. The lights were nice. The path was smooth. The fence beside my property was still there, with the same gap that Cynthia had peered through on a January night to catch a glimpse of my heat lamp glowing red against the cold. I thought, as I walked past it, that sometimes the thing that starts a story is so small. A red lamp on a clamp, a frozen night, a knock on the door before sunrise. And then it unravels into something so much larger, involving documents and meetings and investigations, and people you did not know becoming people you do, and a neighborhood becoming more like what a neighborhood is supposed to be. The heat lamp is still on the shelf in my garage. Ray says I should probably do the proper pipe insulation work this summer while I have access and the weather is cooperative, and I am going to. It will save me the trouble next winter, but I have already decided I am keeping the lamp anyway. It is a good lamp. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. I told that story to Phil one evening on his porch in June, the two of us drinking cold beers and watching the light change over the rooftops of Maplecrest Estates, and he laughed in that way he has that starts somewhere in his chest and takes a while to finish. "You are telling me," he said, "that you spent an entire winter in legal combat with your HOA over a chicken coop lamp." "Utility lamp," I said, "outdoor rated, and she turned out to be stealing from the HOA. Self-dealing," I said, "technically. Same result." "Same result," I agreed. He took a drink and looked out at the street, the clean spring street with no ice and no snow and the trees just starting to fill in properly. "You know what the funniest part is?" he said. "What?" "If she had just let it go," he said, "you never would have looked at the budget." I raised my beer to that. It was exactly right. If Cynthia had seen my heat lamp and thought, "That looks reasonable, carry on," she would have kept collecting her undisclosed payments indefinitely, kept filing violations against anyone who annoyed her, kept her seat on the board, and kept running the neighborhood like her personal committee of one. Instead, she had knocked on my door at 6 in the morning in January to hand me a pre-filled fine for a clamp lamp on an extension cord, and in doing so had started a chain of events that ended her HOA career, put her name on a criminal record, and turned 30-some-odd strangers into actual neighbors. There is probably a lesson in there about picking your battles. I am genuinely not sure if the lesson is for me or for her. Either way, I slept great that winter. Pipes never froze once. And when the next November came around and the forecast started showing those first sub-freezing overnight temperatures, I walked out to my garage, took the heat lamp off the shelf, clipped it to the utility wall, plugged in the extension cord, and turned it on. No violation notice arrived in the morning. No clipboard-carrying figure materialized on my porch before dawn. Just the quiet neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do, people getting on with their lives, keeping their pipes from freezing, and looking out for each other the way they probably should have been doing all along. I like it a lot better this way.